What if everything you believe about Judas Iscariot was wrong? Imagine for a moment that the most hated man in Christianity was not the traitor who destroyed Jesus, but the most faithful disciple, chosen for a mission the few would have the courage to accept. It seems absurd, doesn't it? But the Gospel of Judas, a Gnostic text that remained buried for centuries, reveals a shocking truth. Judas was not a villain, but Jesus' closest confidant charged with a divine task. What if this forbidden truth had been deliberately hidden by the church, which saw in this gospel a mortal risk to its spiritual domain? After all, what would make more sense? A Judas motivated by greed, or a Judas who understood Jesus' deeper purpose? Traditional history teaches us to hate him, but what if the official narrative was a tool of control, and not the truth? With each line we uncover of this censored gospel, we are led to question what we really know about sacrifice, redemption, and the role of apocryphal texts that were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon. Prepare yourself for a journey that will shake your certainties and reveal hidden secrets about Judas, Jesus, and the very essence of the Christian faith. Follow along to the end and discover why forbidden knowledge is still the biggest threat to the official versions of history. Imagine a world in which the pages of sacred history were not written only by the victors. A world where texts like the Gospel of Judas, discovered by chance in the 20th century, had been read openly from the beginning. Instead, for nearly 2 millennia, this text remained buried, literally and metaphorically. It was necessary for the Codex Chacos, a fragile manuscript from the Egyptian desert, to reappear in 1978 for the controversial content of Judas Iscariot to return to the debate. No longer the cursed traitor who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, but a loyal, courageous disciple, chosen for the most difficult of tasks, betraying for love. Here we already have a theological scandal ready to shake any altar, don't you think? The councils that shaped Christianity, such as the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, were not mere gatherings of spiritual scholars exchanging enlightened ideas. They were true political arenas, where winners emerged with divine authority in their pockets and losers saw their texts banned as heretical. The Gospel of Judas never had a chance to survive in this environment. While the Synoptic Gospels presented a passive Jesus faced with a tragic betrayal, the Judas text transformed this narrative into a strategic, almost Machiavellian plot. Imagine the scene: a confident Jesus looking Judas in the eyes and saying, with the serenity of someone who already knows the end of the story, "Whatever you have to do it quickly." If this is not proof of complicity, then what is? But the audacity of the Gospel of Judas does not stop there. He goes further, delving into the dangerous field of Gnosticism, that spiritual current that has always been the thorn in the side of the church. Gnostics were known for believing that salvation did not come from blind faith or obedience to dogma, but from hidden knowledge, gnosis, that profound wisdom that only the initiated could access. In a world where the church consolidated power by offering a single path to God, any suggestion of an individual and introspective spirituality was considered a direct threat. It is no wonder that Gnostic texts were so vehemently persecuted and excluded. And then we come to the question, why Judas? Why make him the pivot of such a controversial narrative? The Gospel of Judas suggests that he was the only disciple who truly understood Jesus. While others were lost in literal interpretations and earthly ambitions, Judas saw beyond the veil. He accepted the role of villain knowing it would condemn him to eternal infamy. This almost heroic view of Judas is a slap in the face of the Christian tradition, which for centuries has portrayed him as the archetype of human treachery. And let's be honest, a redeemed Judas isn't exactly the kind of narrative that fits well in the stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals, is it? If we analyze the historical context, we realize that the Gospel of Judas was not just an alternative text, but a true declaration of theological war. He questioned the authority of the Old Testament God, calling him sackless, an inferior creator. For the Gnostics, Jesus was not the son of a punitive and vengeful God, but of a superior and benevolent entity. This idea directly challenged the theological basis of the Church, which depended on a continuity between Judaism and Christianity to validate its narrative. After all, how would you convince believers that the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old if the central deity itself was called into question? The disappearance of the Gospel of Judas from the historical scene also reveals a lot about the relationship between religion and power. By excluding texts considered heretical, the Church was not only protecting the purity of the faith, but consolidating its position as the only legitimate interpreter of the divine will. The exclusion of the Gospel of Judas was not an isolated act, but part of a broader campaign to eliminate any perspective that challenged the narrative monopoly. Texts like Jude's, which promoted forbidden knowledge and the search for individual enlightenment, threatened the centralized control that the Church exercised over its followers. Now consider the impact this text could have had if it had survived centuries of censorship and persecution. How would he have shaped our understanding of Judas, Jesus, and even God? The idea that Judas' betrayal was an act of love rather than greed completely subverts the traditional narrative. And in the process, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about sacrifice, redemption, and the true costs of following a divine calling. After all, isn't it ironic that Judas, the greatest traitor in history, was perhaps the only one to truly understand what was at stake? And as we ponder this possibility, another question looms on the horizon. Like a shadow in candlelight, how many other texts, like the Gospel of Judas, remain buried, hidden by fear, power, or convenience? How many truths are still out of our reach, waiting for the right moment to resurface and challenge everything we believe we know? Imagine being at the table of the Last Supper, witnessing a moment of calm before the chaos that was to come. Jesus, knowing exactly what the future held, looks at Judas and speaks words that are as enigmatic as they are decisive. Whatever you have to do it quickly. To many, this may sound like handing over a convict, but to those willing to look beyond the surface, this phrase suggests complicity, a plan orchestrated with divine precision. Could Judas, the traitor par excellence, actually be the executor of a deliberate act? A betrayal planned by none other than the Messiah himself? The Gospel of Judas leaves no doubt. The betrayal was part of a greater plan, a necessary piece in the puzzle of redemption. Jesus knew that his death was inevitable and, more than that, essential to fulfill his messianic role. He chose Judas because he trusted him, because he knew he would have the courage to carry the burden of being hated forever. It's ironic, isn't it, that the most villainized man in history may have been the most loyal of all disciples. And while the traditional narrative paints Judas as a greedy villain, this gospel suggests that he was the only one who truly understood the divine mission. But, of course, this view did not please the early church. Imagine the chaos this would cause if it were widely accepted. How can we justify centuries of doctrines based on a victim Jesus and a villainous Judas? How can we rewrite entire sermons that condemn treason as the worst of sins? After all, a narrative in which Jesus and Judas act as accomplices would be an affront to the idea that salvation comes only through faith and obedience. It is much easier to blame Judas than to admit that the betrayal was, in fact, an act of divine strategy. When looking at the traditional Gospels, we find clues that corroborate this view. The Gospel of John, for example, suggests that Jesus had full control over the events leading up to his crucifixion. He was not a passive victim, but a divine strategist, directing events according to a pre-established plan. When he tells Judas to act quickly, there is no surprise or fear, but a calm acceptance of the inevitable. This not only changes how we view Judas, but also how we understand Jesus, not as a powerless martyr, but as a master strategist. And here's the question that troubles us. If Judas was chosen to betray, then did he really have a choice? Or was his betrayal predestined, part of a plan he couldn't refuse? This question forces us to reflect on free will and destiny, themes that have tormented theologians and philosophers for centuries. And as we ponder these questions, we are led to an even deeper point. What if Judas, far from being a villain, was in fact a martyr? A man who agreed to bear the burden of being hated forever, all to fulfill God's plan, Jesus' redemption? Imagine a world in which knowledge was a privilege of the few, carefully guarded like a treasure. Gnosticism, with its promise of salvation through occult knowledge, was like a wayward spark in a dry field. For the Gnostics, spirituality did not depend on external rituals or the intermediation of an institution, but on the individual search for direct connection with the divine. This concept, liberating for some, was seen as an act of forbidden rebellion by the early church, which quickly realized the danger it posed to its centralized authority. The Gnostics dared to say what few had the courage to say, that blind faith was insufficient, and that true salvation required an inner awakening. Texts like the Gospel of Judas were symbols of this spiritual revolution. And, of course, the church was quick to react. Irenaeus of Lyon, at the end of the 2nd century, wrote his famous Against Heresies, describing the Gnostics as dangerous deviants from the true faith. For him, these heretics not only distorted the scriptures, but also threatened the divine order that the church sought to establish. But was this order really divine, or just a strategy to consolidate power? The persecution of Gnosticism was not just a theological issue, but also a battle for narrative control. In a world where the church sought to establish itself as the only voice of truth, ideas like those of the Gnostics, which challenged the need for an institution to reach God, were unacceptable. Texts such as those from Nag Hammadi, discovered in 1945, revealed the depth of Gnostic thought and its influence. Many of these writings extolled the role of knowledge as the key to spiritual freedom, a dangerous notion in a society where the control of knowledge was synonymous with power. Interestingly, the Gnostics also had a unique view of the material world. For them, the physical world was a prison, created by an imperfect and corrupt demiurge, and true liberation could only be achieved through spiritual knowledge. This dualism between matter and spirit was a direct affront to the traditional Christian view, which saw creation as the work of a perfect and benevolent God. By rejecting this premise, Gnosticism exposed the contradictions and weaknesses of official theology, something that the church could not tolerate. The persecution of Gnosticism is a grim reminder of what happens when power meets free thought. Texts like the Gospel of Judas, with its bold and introspective approach, were not only excluded, but censored and persecuted with an almost desperate vehemence. And this leads us to an inevitable reflection. Did the church really fear that these ideas were false? Or was it that, deep down, the real fear was that they were true and capable of freeing the minds that dared to question the dominant narratives? Imagine the figure of Judas Iscariot in a new light, not as the traitor who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, but as the disciple who accepted the supreme sacrifice. The Gospel of Judas presents a revolutionary narrative, where Judas is chosen not for his character flaw, but for his spiritual courage. He knew he would be hated, vilified, and reduced to a symbol of eternal betrayal, and yet he accepted the burden. Could this be the true proof of love? After all, who else would be willing to endure such condemnation to fulfill a divine plan? In Gnostic writings, Judas emerges as the disciple who understood Jesus on a deeper spiritual level than the others. While Peter, John, and the others struggled to understand the Master's teachings, Judas already saw the greater purpose. He did not hand over Jesus out of greed, but because he knew that the crucifixion was necessary for the plan of redemption to be fulfilled. This vision transforms Judas from a villain to a tragic hero, someone who sacrificed his reputation to ensure the salvation of humanity. It's uncomfortable, isn't it, to think that perhaps the most hated figure in Christianity is actually the most misunderstood? And how could the church allow a narrative like this to gain strength? If Judas were seen as a divine instrument, It would append centuries of teaching about guilt, sin, and redemption. After all, the image of Judas as a traitor serves as a convenient warning against disloyalty. But if it is a symbol of sacrifice, that message falls apart. What remains, then, of the traditional discourse? The Gospel of Judas, by transforming the traitor into a martyr, calls into question the entire theological structure built on guilt and fear. There is also something deeply human about this story. Who among us doesn't know the weight of being misunderstood, of making difficult decisions that others deem wrong? Judas, in this context, is not just a biblical character, but a reflection of the human condition. He reminds us that the most difficult choices are not always seen as the noblest. And yet, it is these choices that shape destiny. Judas may not be the hero we expected, but perhaps he is the hero we needed. And so, the Gospel of Jude invites us to reevaluate our conceptions of good and evil, of sacrifice and betrayal. Wouldn't it be the greatest irony in history that Judas, the archetypal traitor, was also the greatest example of love and devotion? If this is true, what else could we be misinterpreting in the sacred texts? This is a question that, once asked, is impossible to ignore. Imagine opening an ancient manuscript and finding not just stories, but hidden secrets about the creation of the universe and the true nature of God. The Gospel of Judas, far from being just an alternative account of the life of Jesus, delves into the depths of Gnostic cosmogony. It reveals a God who is not the benevolent creator described in the traditional Bible, but an inferior being called sackless, whose work is marked by corruption and error. For Gnostics, this material world is not the masterpiece of a perfect God, but a prison that hides true spiritual light. This view radically subverts the official narrative. While the Church asserted that God was omnipotent and omniscient, the Gospel of Jude suggested that the supreme deity was beyond the God of the Old Testament. He proposed a separation between the transcendent God, of whom Jesus was the emissary, and the demiurge, who created the physical world. It's an idea that not only challenged Christian theology, but also struck at the heart of the mythologies that influenced Gnostic thought, such as Babylonian and Egyptian beliefs about the struggle between light and darkness. Could this be an attempt to redefine spirituality, separating it from the constraints of religious tradition? The Gospel of Judas also addresses the origin of the soul and its ultimate purpose. According to the text, humanity is trapped in a cycle of ignorance imposed by the demiurge, but carries within itself a divine spark. True salvation, therefore, does not come from rituals or external beliefs, but from hidden knowledge that frees the soul from matter. This view echoes Hermetic thinking and esoteric traditions, which have always emphasized the search for inner enlightenment. But by placing self-knowledge above institutionalized faith, the text became a direct threat to the Church's spiritual monopoly. Interestingly, this occult theology also offers a new perspective on the relationship between Jesus and Judas. If Judas was chosen to play his role because he possessed a deeper understanding of the truth, then he did not just betray Jesus. He fulfilled a cosmic purpose. Judas' sacrifice was not just an act of loyalty, but a key to unlocking the mysteries of the universe. This narrative transforms the gospel into a spiritual guide, offering insights that remain as provocative today as they were 2,000 years ago. And so, the Gospel of Judas challenges us to question not only the story of creation, but also the foundations of our own faith. If the Gnostic view is correct, then everything we consider sacred can be reevaluated. Are we trapped in an illusion created by powers we do not understand? And most importantly, how can we seek the truth amidst so many layers of censorship and persecution? The answers, as always, remain hidden, waiting for those who dare seek them. Imagine the tension in a candlelit room at a decisive 4th century council, where powerful men discussed the fate of texts that would shape the faith of generations. Texts like the Gospel of Judas were more than controversial. They were dangerous. The Church, in its quest to establish a universal biblical canon, justified the exclusion of apocryphal writings under the banner of spiritual protection. But was the true objective to protect the souls of the faithful, or to guarantee narrative control over sacred truths? After all, the power of a text is undeniable, and whoever controls it controls faith. The councils of Carthage and other decisive meetings did not limit themselves to choosing texts that built faith. They also served as an ideological filter, eliminating any threat to the Church's theological dominance. Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Judas, offered a perspective that promoted forbidden knowledge and an individual spirituality. This approach decentralized power and placed salvation in the hands of each individual, rather than relying on an institution. Of course, this didn't sit well with religious leaders, who needed a cohesive narrative to maintain their influence over the people. The exclusion of apocryphal texts also reflects a deep fear, the fear that these alternative ideas could shake the faith of the faithful. The Gospel of Judas, by reimagining Judas as an ally rather than a traitor, directly attacked the basis of one of Christianity's most important narratives. But was censorship really a spiritual protection? Or was the Church afraid that access to these texts would reveal contradictions and weaknesses in official theology? The persecution of Gnostic texts suggests that control was as spiritual as it was political. Interestingly, apocryphal texts also have an almost irresistible appeal. Their exclusion makes them all the more fascinating, like forbidden secrets waiting to be discovered. The Gospel of Judas is not just an alternative account, but a provocation, a call to question the official version of events. What if the Church's true intention in deleting these texts was to protect its authority and not the purity of the faith? After all, the more controlled access to information is, the more powerful the institution that controls it becomes. And here we are, centuries later, still puzzled by the gaps left by these excluded texts. Were the Gospel of Judas and other apocrypha eliminated because they were false or because they were too true? The question remains unanswered. But one thing is certain. Deleted texts have not disappeared. They continue to challenge us, provoking us to look beyond the official versions and seek the truths that remain hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. Imagine looking at the pages of an ancient text and finding a portrait of God so different that it makes you question everything you've ever heard. The Gospel of Judas dares to reject the figure of the punitive God of the Old Testament, proposing a vision of a superior, spiritual, and transcendent God. This Gnostic text is a direct criticism of the demiurge, called sackless or fool, who, according to the Gnostics, created the material world, full of corruption and suffering. It is as if the Gospel invites readers to see beyond the veil, separating the true God from the one who governs matter and illusion. This attack on the God of the Old Testament was not only theological, but also symbolic. For the Gnostics, the God who demanded sacrifices and punished without mercy was a caricature of power, not an expression of the divine. The Gospel of Judas describes a Jesus who came to reveal the true Father, the one who is beyond material creation and human laws. This view directly challenged the foundations of institutional Christianity, which depended on the continuity between Judaism and Christianity to validate its theology. How can we justify the canonical Gospels while discarding the vision of God they inherit? Interestingly, this idea is not completely isolated. Many esoteric and heretical traditions throughout history have also challenged the God of the Old Testament, connecting him to lesser god archetypes in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Babylonian mythology. Could the Gospel of Judas be an echo of these ancient cosmologies? He seems to suggest that the true God is not the one who rules with fear, but the one who liberates through hidden knowledge. This distinction calls into question not only the role of God, but also the religious structures that were built around him. Criticism of the punitive God also carries profound implications for human spirituality. If the material world is an imperfect creation, then the spiritual quest must not be for obedience, but for transcendence. The Gospel of Jude invites us to question the nature of divinity and reflect on how religious interpretations shape our lives. He challenges the idea of a God who rewards and punishes, suggesting that true divinity transcends good and evil, offering freedom rather than servitude. And so, the Gospel of Judas leaves us with a provocation. Is the God we learn to fear the true one? Or was it simply a reflection of human limitations, designed to maintain order and control? This question, unsettling in its simplicity, resonates not only in the context of Gnostic theology, but also in our ongoing quest to understand the divine. And as we think about this, another question arises. What is the next myth we need to deconstruct? Imagine Judas Iscariot not as a man, but as a mirror reflecting our own contradictions. The Gospel of Judas not only revisits the events of betrayal, but also recontextualizes them as a metaphor for the human condition. In it, Judas represents all of us, imperfect, constantly divided between the material world and the search for something greater. It symbolizes the human dilemma of betraying what we love most, not out of malice, but because we are trapped in a corrupt and limited reality. Would Judas then be the most faithful portrait of humanity? The Gnostics believed in a world divided between matter and spirit, and the Gospel of Judas delves deep into this duality. Judas, by betraying Jesus, not only fulfills a divine role, but also reminds us of the weight we carry living in a world governed by imperfect laws. He's not only the traitor, but also a tragic hero who accepts his task knowing that he will be condemned by it. This vision not only challenges us to rethink Judas, but also to look at our own actions in a new light. Could it be that our betrayals are also part of something bigger that we cannot understand? The Gnostic text also uses Jude to explore the idea of fall and redemption. Just like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Judas is tempted to act against what seems right, only to discover that his action was necessary for a greater purpose. This interpretation completely subverts the traditional narrative, offering a more complex and unsettling perspective. Judas is not the villain, but a man burdened with impossible choices. It's uncomfortable, yes, but perhaps also liberating to think that even our flaws have a place in the grand cosmic plan. And here's the most intriguing point. If Judas represents fallen humanity, it may also symbolize the possibility of transcendence. By accepting his role in Jesus' plan, he demonstrates a deep understanding of sacrifice and purpose. Isn't it ironic that the most hated man in biblical history could be the one who understood Jesus better than anyone else? Perhaps in this sense, Judas is not just an example of what is wrong with us, but also of what we can become. The Gospel of Judas, by reinterpreting betrayal, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. He challenges us to question whether the choices we consider failures are actually opportunities for growth. And as we reflect on this, the inevitable question arises: is the world with all its imperfections just a betrayal on a cosmic scale? And if so, what would be the greater purpose we are destined to fulfill? Imagine the first centuries of Christianity, a time when the streets of Rome and Alexandria were teeming with conflicting religious ideas. In this effervescent scenario, Gnosticism was not just an alternative, but a direct competition to the growing institutionalization of the Church. Texts, such as those found in Nag Hammadi, including the Gospel of Judas, were widely discussed and shared. They offered an intimate and individual spirituality, centered on occult knowledge and gnosis, in contrast to the centralized authority of the Church. For an institution in formation, Gnosticism was more than a heresy. It was a threat. The popularity of Gnosticism among early Christians is not surprising. He offered answers to questions that official doctrine avoided. Why is the world so full of suffering? What is the true purpose of existence? While the Church emphasized obedience and blind faith, Gnosticism encouraged questioning and the search for inner truth. This profoundly liberating approach appealed to many who felt limited by the rigid structures of emerging religion. And this, of course, put the Gnostics squarely on the path to ecclesiastical power. The fear of the church was so palpable that it led to systematic persecution against the Gnostics and their texts. Irenaeus of Lyon, in his work Against Heresies, was one of the first to vehemently denounce Gnosticism, calling it a poison for souls. But would it really be? Or was Gnosticism just a threat to the church's narrative monopoly? The discovery of the Nag Hammadi scrolls in 1945 revealed the depth and sophistication of these texts, showing that the Gnostics were not just heretics, but sophisticated thinkers who challenged the religious conventions of their time. The rise of Gnosticism also revealed a flaw in institutional Christianity: its inability to offer universal answers to deep spiritual questions. While the church promised salvation through rituals and dogmas, the Gnostics offered a more introspective path, which spoke directly to the individual's heart. This approach threatened to destabilize the centralized control the church sought to establish, leading it to label the Gnostics as enemies of the faith. But were they enemies or just bearers of an alternative truth? And so, Gnosticism was relegated to the margins of history, its texts banned and its followers persecuted. But ironically, this suppression only increased the fascination with these ideas. Today, centuries later, Gnostic texts continue to challenge our understanding of spirituality and religion, and they leave us with a question that the church might prefer to avoid. What if the Gnostics were right all along? Imagine the Garden of Eden in a new light, not as the site of humanity's first fall, but as the stage for an awakening. For the Gnostics, the act of eating the forbidden fruit was not a sin, but a step towards occult knowledge. The Gospel of Judas echoes this vision, presenting the search for knowledge as an act of courage rather than rebellion. Just as Adam and Eve challenged the authority of the Creator, Judas also dared to defy expectations, not out of greed or betrayal, but as part of a divine plan that aimed to transcend the limitations imposed by material creation. The Gnostic text reinterprets the myth of the fall, suggesting that the serpent, often seen as a symbol of evil, was actually a bearer of wisdom. Judas, in this context, takes on a similar role. He is the figure who bears the burden of delivering the truth, even if it means facing eternal damnation. This vision completely subverts the traditional narrative, transforming Judas from traitor to liberator. And isn't it ironic that what was considered forbidden is actually the key to true spiritual freedom? The Gospel of Jude also makes an implicit criticism of the control of information by religion. The search for knowledge has always been viewed with suspicion by institutions that depend on obedience. The myth of forbidden knowledge serves as a reminder that knowledge has a cost, and often, that cost is the alienation of those who prefer the comfort of ignorance. Judas, by accepting his role in Jesus' plan, demonstrates that knowledge is a responsibility, not just a privilege. But why is knowledge so feared? For the Gnostics, the answer was clear: because it frees. Knowing the truth about divine nature and material reality destroys the illusions that keep people submissive. The Gospel of Judas, by revealing a radically different theology, threatened to dismantle the control system of the early church. It is no wonder that he was excluded, persecuted, and relegated to oblivion. But, as always, the truth has a way of emerging, even after centuries of attempted concealment. The Gospel of Judas leaves us with a profound reflection. What if the true sin is not seeking knowledge, but avoiding it? What if the most important truths are the ones we were taught to fear? This idea, at once unsettling and liberating, challenges us to reevaluate not only the story of Judas, but also our own role in the search for knowledge. Are we ready to face the consequences of questioning what we have always been told is unquestionable? If you felt that this forbidden knowledge opened up new possibilities in the way you see the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we explore the deepest mysteries and challenge the narratives that limit us. Until the next video.